Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. For 50 years, since Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb in 1968, we've believed that less population is essential to our own survival. Our movies and popular culture have been filled with dystopian science fiction ideas around the idea of overpopulation, using everything from birth control to mass genocide. Movies like The Avengers, Soylent Green, Logan's Run, Inferno, and Fortress, just to name a few, have been built on our primal fear of America with too many people. Our fear of immigration, in part, comes out of this mindset. Today, the onset of climate change, shortages of water, and decaying infrastructure have all reinforced this notion as science fiction gives way to real science. But what if there's a fundamental flaw in the logic? What if more people are actually better, or that it could solve some of our problems? And if so, better for what? Do 1 billion Chinese give that country more power, more money, and more clout? My guest, Matt Yglesias, thinks we need to think about tripling the population of the U.S., and that it could well be our greatest asset in the coming battle for influence and dominance with China and India. Matt Yglesias is the co-founder and senior correspondent for Vox. He also hosts the political podcast The Weeds and is a regular contributor to NPR. It is my pleasure to welcome Matt Yglesias here to talk about 1 billion Americans, the case for thinking bigger. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
First of all, as we look around, we see that there are more homeless on our streets, that our democracy is frayed, that our roads are clogged, our healthcare system has been taken to the brink. How is more people better?
Well, you know what? The question is, are these problems that we can solve, or are they problems that we cannot solve, right? Homelessness is a terrible problem in America. It is scandalous that we have people who can't get a place to live. It's particularly scandalous because we know how to build more houses, right? It costs zero public dollars to create more houses, but instead we have a government, particularly in your part of the country, that just makes it illegal to build apartment buildings in places where there's incredible levels of expense. Like, we can change that stuff. We can create plenty of houses for all the people that we want. So the question is, like, why is population growth desirable? There's two parts to that. One is simply, like, Americans would like to have more children than they have. Not a lot more children. We're not talking, huge families, stuff like that. But Americans have fewer kids than they say they want to have. And they say the reason for that is they can't afford it. In particular, they can't afford the child care. So these are, we should have programs to help people get their kids into preschool, to help out a little bit with the cash you need at the beginning of life. The other part of this is immigration. We know there's a lot of people who would like to move here. We know that historically, America has drawn incredible strength from immigrants. And that's everywhere from so many of the people who found our big technology companies to so many of the people who pick the fruits and vegetables that we eat are from abroad. We should be welcoming that as a source of strength, as we historically have. Now, obviously, there are going to be some issues, right? More people, more problems to some extent on the transportation front, a few other things. The fun of this book, to me, if anyone happens to care to buy it, is thinking these things through, right? It's like, how do we deal with the housing piece? How do we deal with the transportation piece? How do we structure the welfare state to support families? How do we think about immigration so that we can be more generous but also smarter about who comes here?
Years ago, Donald Rumsfeld used to have this saying that the solution to an intractable problem was to create a bigger problem, and that maybe that would help. There's a sense that that's what you're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking here is, look, we have so many little problems, right? Whether it's traffic jams in one place or a tax base that can't support the infrastructure. I was speaking to a radio station in Detroit, and, they don't have big traffic jams in Detroit. The problem they have is they don't have enough tax revenue to fill their potholes. If we have big national goals historically, we have met big challenges. But right now we've fallen into a kind of culture war politics where, people who like to drive pickup trucks and people who like to drive Priuses or whatever just kind of yell at each other. and all of our politics all the time is Americans fighting with each other. And I would like us to get to a place where we are talking about something we have in common. I don't think anyone in this country wants to live in a world of Chinese hegemony, in which, the kind of country that has Uyghurs in concentration camps, that's crushing liberties in Hong Kong, where they are the number one power in the world. If we can reason together as a country, we can solve these problems, and we can also solve the big problem of our kind of internal domestic warfare.
Does the power and influence of China, though, depend on having a larger population? What's the nexus between 1 billion people and the potential for Chinese hegemony?
Well, you look at China on a per capita basis. They are about as wealthy as Mexico or Bulgaria, depending on whose statistical series you think. And, you maybe go to Mexico on vacation. If you're an American, you probably don't go to Bulgaria. I have some good friends who are from there. But those are not those countries don't make the headlines, right? We don't think about, how do we meet the foreign policy challenge of Bulgaria? Because they don't matter that much. Then conversely, you have rich countries like Canada, New Zealand, very nice places, democracies, high standard of living, but they also don't count for that much on the world stage. The United States counts for a lot. China counts for a lot. And that's because they're big countries. They're countries with a lot of people. And it really matters in the Chinese sense. There was this great report from PEN America, and it came out. It was about how Hollywood movie studios now let Chinese censors dictate to them what can be the content of their movies because they need access to the China market. And if we let China keep growing, right, the question is, where does that go next? Right now, Disney censors its movies to please China's government. Disney also owns ABC News, right? As far as we know, they don't censor ABC News to make the Chinese government happy. But at the end of the day, if Disney is dependent on the China market to get their Avengers movies and their Star Wars movies profitable, they may have to make that call, right? NBC Universal owns a lot of domestic news properties here in the United States. They could face the same pressures too. It's a very honestly threatening environment. And right now, we have this kind of dispute about TikTok. But going to war with Chinese video meme apps is not equal to the size and scale of the issue we're dealing with here, which is simply that if China becomes the world's number one economy, that's going to give them more and more power in the international realm.
But is our lack of power or declining soft power, is that being determined by lack of scale, lack of population?
I think it clearly is. I wouldn't even put it that way. The reason we have as much power as we have now, the reason the United States is a so much bigger deal on the world stage than Canada or Ireland or some other countries are, is that we are so much bigger than those countries. We are the number 3 country in the world in population. That's a really big deal. The problem is that as China has become less and less poor, the fact that they are bigger than we are looms larger. And if we get back on a trajectory of growth, we can recapture that lead. Note that historically, we have had very rapid population growth. There's a reason that there's 10 times as many Americans as there are Canadians, right? That's a deliberate policy choice that our government made over the years to be welcoming to people from around the world, to do the Homestead Act so people could have their own farms. We were early in having high schools, early in having universal primary education. And I want to get the United States back to leading in terms of immigration and leading in terms of education so that we can have robust families, robust growth, and ultimately national strength.
In terms of finding those areas where we can exercise leadership, is it just a question of size, or is it also a question of creativity? Do we need to not think about big things in a big way and think of the evolution of the country more as a boutique as opposed to a department store?
I think we need to think about what is America and what is America all about, right? We currently have a president who talks a lot about national greatness, talks about making America great again. But his idea of greatness is so backward looking. It's so nostalgic. And frankly, it's racially and ethnically exclusionary a lot of the time. But the foundation of American greatness, right? In our moments of peril, as Abraham Lincoln said at Gettysburg, or as George Washington said addressing recent Irish immigrants, has always been by getting closer into touch with our founding values of freedom and equality and embracing them and embracing a more diverse, richer vision of America so that we can incorporate more people can live up to their sort of full national potential. There was this amazing report from Citibank the other day, and they were trying to look at sort of what is the economic cost of racial discrimination, right? And it came into the trillions. And then you can ask the same. It's like, well, what is the economic cost of xenophobia, right? Of the impulse to turn away talented foreigners who could be here working. And that's also in the trillions, right? Like, we can, by being our best selves in an ethical sense, also be our best selves in a sense of prosperity and power.
How does climate change enter into this equation? How do you account for that in looking at tripling the size of the country?
Climate change is a really hard problem. It is too hard of a problem to solve through austerity and thinking of doing less. An economist named J.W. Mason, he did a great report for the Roosevelt Institute recently, and he was looking at World War II, right? And so, how did we meet that incredible challenge? How did we make all those planes, all those tanks? How did we feed all those troops? And he shows that the domestic economy, the civilian economy, actually grew while that was happening, right? That what we did was we mobilized more resources, we produced more. And so he says we should be thinking about a Green New Deal, which a lot of people are talking about. And that means huge investments in clean energy, in electric vehicles, in batteries, in things that let us have great, prosperous lives with sustainable kind of roots, right? It's not that we're going to not use electricity. It's we're going to make clean electricity.
As we look at the practical side of this, talk about the notion of where you put 1 billion people.
You put them all kinds of places, right? You put them in rural communities. Right now, most rural counties are losing population. Right now, a lot of our cities, Detroit is about half of where it was. St. Louis has lost about 60% of its people. So we can have lots more people there, right? We can have more people in our suburbs. But we can also have more people in very expensive type places, right? You go to Palo Alto, elsewhere in Silicon Valley, and you have people paying, millions of dollars for modest-sized single-family homes with little lawns. Some of those things should be redeveloped as mid-sized apartment buildings. You could easily have far more people gaining housing, gaining access to these big job centers near the Bay Area, near Seattle, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., where I live. We're not out of space, right? So 1 billion is a big number. I think you would agree. I think everybody thinks that. But the population density of the United States at 1 billion would be about the density of France, about half the density of Germany, about a third the density of the United Kingdom. So I've been to France. It's really nice. They've got countryside there. They got cities there. They got small towns there. They got some beaches. They've got vineyards. So there's no geographical problem, right? People are just going to go different places.
Talk a little bit about immigration and whether or not in this concept, as you see it, we have to be selective with respect to immigration with regard to skilled versus unskilled immigrants.
I think that we should look at getting more skilled immigrants. What I don't agree with is an idea of kicking out less skilled workers. There's no real problem with the immigrants that we have. They're beneficial to the country on average. But when we talk about having more growth, right, and growing at a more rapid pace, we should be making it easier for skilled foreign professionals to move here, to practice medicine, to be computer programmers, to whatever else it is, since, they will grow our tax base, essentially, right, and make it easier to afford the things that we need.
Talk about what we hear from millennials and Generation Z not wanting more kids.
Well, this is interesting. I'm a millennial myself, an old millennial at 39, and what polls say is that millennials actually want about as many kids as people in the early 80s wanted. What they say is that they can't afford as many kids as they would like to have. And that's primarily because the cost of childcare has gotten so exorbitant. Healthcare and housing also sort of parts of the puzzle. And so we need to do things to support that. Some of it is regulatory changes that I talk about. There's some detailed things there, but there's fundamental economic reasons why the opportunity cost of children has gone up over time. And we sort of need to decide as a society, like, do we want people to have great families and happy lives with children? Or do we want, America to sort of wither away over the long term and then say, well, it's fine because we have a lot of streaming video on Netflix. I think streaming video on Netflix is great, right? But like, there's more to life than consumer technology, right? It's an incredible source of fulfillment to people to have and raise children, even though the burdens of it are also large. And, we need to support them with some cash when the kids are young, with preschool when they're older, with programming for people to do in the summertime, with some kind of solution to the college affordability crisis. I mean, there's a lot of dimensions to this, but we got to do it.
One of the things we certainly see in China with their large population and in India as well is the way in which it depresses wages. Talk about that and the danger of that if we were to grow the population that large here.
Research just really shows that immigrants do not depress wages. We had a great example of this recently after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. That caused a lot of people from the island to migrate to Orlando. They're not immigrants technically, I should be clear, but it's an influx of new people into the city of Orlando. And precisely because Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, they're allowed to come in unlimited numbers. So it's a really good test. So then the scholars, they looked at, well, what happened in the Orlando area as a result of all these people coming in? And they showed that wages did go down in the construction industry and a lot more stuff got built. At the same time, wages went up in food service and retail because there were a lot more customers. On average, wages were about even, right? So native-born people were no worse off. They were the same. The people who came from Puerto Rico, they were much better off. And the cost of building new housing went down. So in the long run, people benefit. And that's exactly what studies of the Mario boat lift into Cuba have shown. It's what studies of the end of the Bracero program have shown, that in the short term, there's no wage impact of immigrants. And in the long term, there's a benefit because you get, it's called a deeper capital stock. Basically, you have more buildings, more machinery, more equipment, things like that. So immigration is really positive economically. And I know a lot of people don't believe that, but it's true. And, part of why I wrote this book is to convince them. We can see it in pretty great detail in the writing there.
Talk a little bit about infrastructure, things like water and power, energy. I mean, in California now, as you well know, our most populous state, we have regular blackouts, regular power outages, triple the size, and the problems are 3 times as bad.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because you look at California and the problems that you guys have with your electricity transmission lines, right? And so you could say, well, why don't they just bury all the lines, right? Where I live in D.C., the lines are buried. So there's no need to worry about them falling down in the wind or something like that. And it's too expensive to do it because there's actually not enough people there, right? When you have more people, you can support higher grade infrastructure in certain regards. Then there's other parts of the country, where just the roads are crumbling and wasting away because there aren't enough people to support them. That being said, we have some big problems with infrastructure, right? The East Side Access Tunnel program in New York and the Second Avenue subway there have come in at such astronomical costs. And one of the things I talk about in the book is, why is it that tunnels in the United States cost so much more, multiples of what they pay in France or Sweden or Korea or Spain or Japan? And what can we learn from other countries about how to build more infrastructure? Because I think whether we grow the population or not, we are clearly going to need new infrastructure, particularly for our electricity grid. And we need to find ways to get it done affordably.
As you envision this, over what time frame would you see the population growing to these levels?
I'm thinking 80 years. The basic idea is we are in the year 2020 now. If our population grew at the current population growth rate of Canada, then by 2100, we would have 1 billion people. China's population is shrinking slowly. They're projected to hit 1 billion also at 2100. So the idea is we grow that way. We triple over the next 80 years. We maintain our lead forever. And, it's going to be all good.
Matt Yglesias, his book is 1 Million Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger. Matt, I thank you so much for spending time with us here on the Who, What, Why podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.